Yeah, greetings, bonjour, and wagwan. My name is Quentin Vercetty Lindsey, and my field of studies is in art education, looking at creating Afrofuturism as a pedagogy, art pedagogy to be specific. And my field of work deals with public art and reimagining public space to be an afrotopia, essentially a safe space for Black people to exist and to be represented in the landscape. And a lot of my work deals with the realms of speculative fiction. And so I'm remixing ideas of the past in regards to African history, culture, knowledge, and traditions, and I'm projecting them forward for the future. So my relationship between my personal identity and anti-Black racism work is not only because I'm Black, but more specifically, I come from a lineage of people who believe in unity and believe in the betterment for humanity. And so a part of my identity is being a Rasta and coming from a Rasta background and being of Jamaican descent. And, if anyone knows who Bob Marley is, or if you want to Google him, one of his popular songs is One Love, and a part of that is looking at this idea that we all can unite and build with each other. But on top of that, um, is removing all type of systems of oppression. And so my work with anti-Black racism all stems from this idea that we need to have one love to move forward. And without that, then we're always going to be going in circles, or even worse, we're going to be going backwards. You know what I mean? But coming from a Jamaican background, we say forward ever and backwards never. And so that means we have to keep pushing humanity forward, and we have to keep pushing the world forward for us to continue to grow sustainably and in equitable ways. Granted, everything that's going on in the world, or as we say, in the earth, some of the things that I feel like is most important in regards to like what I consider the pandemic, and with anti-Black racism and the treatment of Black women and trans folks and everyone, is thinking about the future, and thinking about how do we think about African culture, African people, African resources, which is essentially sustaining the world at the moment. Um, and what I mean by that is there is ongoing misinformation and an uneducated or ignorant, in a way, projection about African people across the globe, across the diaspora. And this projection continues to perpetrate negative ideas, negative connotations, but also continues to create disservices to nations around the world, but also people in those nations. And so everything intersects, and for me, I'm highly informed by Kimberly Crenshaw's work about intersectionality, where you can't you can't uh, you can't separate the systems of oppression of how it affects Black people and specifically Black women, and even more on another level, queer folks and trans folks. And so we have to think about the future, because the present time that we are in right now is full of misinformation, and it's full of propaganda and full of media feeding us what they think we should know. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, as it relates to COVID-19 and everything, what we're seeing is the statistics are it's affecting those who are in the margins the most. And so when we think about uh, places of poverty, when we think about these places of violence, these are the most vulnerable people in the globe, you know, and the people who get affected the most are often mothers, are often Black women, often trans folks, and so we see COVID um, actually being almost like a racist disease in a lot of ways. If you look at the statistics in America, and also the rise in statistics in Canada as well, and specifically in Toronto and Montreal. And so This relates to the future because we need to start thinking about how can we work towards a better future. And the only way that can happen is through a process I call sancophonology. And sancophonology is learning about the past, but specifically with an African lens. So learning about the African histories and learning about the African cultures um, with specific intent and obviously through guidance and using those things, using those positive things, using those things that we can utilize in the present to build towards a better future. And so Sankophonology recognizes that the past, present, and future are all connected. And so what do I mean by that? So we see that there's a lot of resources coming out of Africa. This is herbal resources, there's a lot of medicine that are extracted from African plants that can only grow on the continent. There's so many that I can name. If you were to look up Dr. Sebi, um, with his alkaline diet, he was a really strong advocate, still is, even though he's now transitioned to be ancestor. And so many people who have advocated for uh, natural medicines, and holistic practices of medicine. Because what we find now is pharmaceuticals are not really in the business of healing people. It's just really a bandage practice. And so if we look at some of these holistic methods, um, we'll see that there are a lot of African practices that are that has a lot of strong antiviral components, and I come from a culture where we say it's better to prevent it's prevention is better than cure. And so there's a lot of holistic practices that we see coming out from the African continent that the world is starting to adapt. So a lot of like vegan practices, in Rastafari we say ital. Ital is vital. And so a lot of these things are important to learn about, and a lot of these herbs are important to learn about because a lot of these things we can use and bring it forward into the future and use in the present. So again, sound code phonology, but more specifically in education. And then for me, I look at art. What are the visuals that we are seeing in society that are making us become informed about how we think about our future? Right now, in this present time, as I speak to you in this contemporary epoch, there's a lot of imagery of seeing Black people being battered and beaten and being oppressed or being violent, and a lot of negative visualization of Black people right now that we see in the media. And um, and this affects the psyche on so many multiple levels. And then on the next level, we're seeing a phenomenon of monuments, of colonial monuments collapsing. But now the question is, what are going to replace those monuments? What type of images can heal the psyche of the Black diaspora and the African diaspora? And so for me, the answer to that is Afrofuturism. And so Afrofuturism is really, again, looking at ancient, and not even just ancient, but looking at the history from the continent, looking at the history of the diaspora and taking things from that and moving it forward, and building upon those things. And so one of those examples is Black Panther, and rest in peace to Chadwick Boseman. And that took the world by storm. It's one of the top all-time selling grossing films, and it's still highly being highly revered. And that's because we are seeing images based on African cultures, based on African people that have never been seen before. And so we're now seeing what a green city could look like, environmentally friendly, economically friendly city could look like. And so it brings questions into like, what are the things that we are doing in the present to make our cities more sustainable as it relates to the earth, you know? And and also like with going back to just referencing Black Panther again, we see like, the heart-shaped herb, as the thing that empowers the panther and that empowers the people, and so again, we're looking at vegetation and agriculture and et cetera, et cetera. Where now in this moment in time, it's so important because any type of antidote or vaccine that's going to be pushed forward, it has to have natural remedies in it. It's going to have natural extracts in it. Where does vitamin C come from? You can't get that from meat. You get that only from the earth. You know. Um, but anyway, this is not an advocacy for veganism. This is more about education, and for me, it's about the visuals, right? The education starts with the visuals. If we look at what we call the classical time period within European art, and even before that, if you even go back to ancient Africa, places like Kemet, places like ancient Congo, places like ancient Great Zimbabwe, places like ancient Aksum, Abyssinia, etc., they use visuals to educate the people. And so, what we don't realize is that the media is using visuals to educate people, to make us think about ourselves in certain ways and make people think about us in certain ways. And so, we need to challenge that in this moment in time. And we really need to push alternative narratives that are empowering, but also creating unity. And again, speaking to this idea of one love and humanity. And so, for me, I embed that into my work. I embed that into my work as much as I can. I have an art piece called "Dance for Her Pride," and that art piece um, was inspired by my grandmother and my great grandmother. They love to dance, and uh, they're very religious or pious in a lot of ways, and they were Baptists, and they get into what they call the spirit, where they jump up and ha ha hey ha ha, and it was interesting because when I went to Ghana and to South Africa, I saw what that meant to be in the spirit. And that just meant you were now connected to something bigger, something deeper. And and in that moment your body moves, your body is free. There's a sense of liberation that comes with that. And we're seeing that right now, as art is a thing that is helping people deal with the depression of the lockdown and quarantine. Art in so many ways are uplifting people's spirits on so many levels. And so Dance for Her Pride is me imagining my great grandmother and my grandmother being able to feel free enough, liberated enough, safe enough to dance in public and be in the spirit in the public. And so that's something I would like to see for the future. And so in that art piece, I had different grandmothers who I've met in my travels. So I didn't have my actual grandmother in the art piece, but I had a grandmother who I met in Haiti. I had a grandmother who I met in Belize. I had a grandmother who I met in South Africa, and I had a grandmother who I met in Montreal. And I put these four queens, these matriarchs, into this picture, and they're all dancing, and then they're standing beside these lioness. And for me, it speaks to this idea again of this intersectionality on so many different levels, but again, this idea of unity and the afrotopia, and showing an image that I would like to see for the future, that I would like to work towards. How can we make society a safer place, and and a place that people feel safe, you know? Because right now in this moment in time, my grandmother would never feel safe to just dance freely, for all different type of reasons. Again, speaking to this idea of intersectionality. And so um, I try to embed these ideas into my work. And so another example of that, um, that's coming to mind at this moment, is the Library of Unlearning. And so for me, I've never been a fan of post-secondary, despite being doing my master's. But because I recognize that for a very long time, especially in Canada, despite what people want to think, that we as Black people who came to this country weren't allowed to be educated in this country. My parents came here in the '60s, and they weren't able to go to school because there was all these legislation and restrictions that were put on them as immigrants. But then on top of that, they recognized that Black people were being pushed to a very specific place and through a very specific pipeline. Even if you were here before, even if you identify as a part of being the lineage of loyalist Black Canadians, or even if you go further back, the Arcadians who came from France, or even if you go further back, the Africans who came here before Samuel du Champlain and before Cartier. And if you don't believe me, please feel free to Google that there were Black people who came here with the indigenous folks. Um, but like a lot of them still face the systemic uh, barriers that prevented them from achieving certain levels of education because they were seen as only being able to go so far, because going into post-secondary institutions for a very long time, society saw that as useless. And so the reason why I'm mentioning this, because for a very long time I felt like the only way I could educate people is through art and not through theory, you know. And so now I'm in an interesting place where I'm finally being able to put the theory to my practice and to my art. And so a lot of the things that I'm bringing forward are not necessarily the things that I've created, but the things I've cultivated through the knowledge that I've gained from my elders and through the research. And I feel like the biggest gap right now is the gap of the knowledge of the past and those who are the elders and those who have been doing the practice and disseminating that knowledge to the masses. And so I feel like that's one of the things I believe we need to focus on moving forward, how to bridge that gap and how to start thinking more about what are we doing to make the future that we all want to see. So I have many recommendations in terms of what people can do to be a part of this change, to make things better, and what I consider to be the change reaction. And one of those things is doing due diligence with learning more about the history of this land, and some of the documentation about it. So that goes all the way from the treaties to, again, like what I referenced, some of the Black Arcadians, some of the Black Indigenous people who were here, who were allies to the Indigenous people here. Learning about people like Mathew Dacosta, you know, um, and so many others that again, I don't want to give everything away because I don't believe in spoon feeding people. I rather show people how to catch the fish and let them learn how to fish themselves. And so essentially, there's a lot of work out there that I feel like people are just lazy in a lot of ways, and don't want to look for it. And so a book that's coming out that I helped to co-edit with the great Dr. Audrey Hudson is called Cosmic Underground Northside Incantations of Black Canadian Discourse and Discontent. And this book is going to be Canada's first Afrofuturism book. It's coming out in the fall of 2020. And essentially, it speaks about coexistence for for the future. Black futurism and Afrofuturism is indigenous futurism. They go hand in hand because it's about the earth. It's about how are we creating sustainable practices. And so I would encourage people to look out for that book, not just because it's my book, but because we have writers who are Afro-Indigenous, and then we have all different type of folks who are from the different parts of the diaspora and are from across Canada, all sharing their views on how can we work towards a more sustainable future. And so that's something I would suggest to people to look at, because in that there are also resources. One of the things I've learned in post-secondary was uh, essays and academic work and scholarly work is a conversation. And so one of the great things about um, this book is that you can see some of the references and the resources of the conversations that these people are referring to. So it helps with doing deeper research, in my opinion. I hope people start thinking about themselves as ancestors. That would be my main message, because when you think of yourself as an ancestor, you recognize that you have an accountability. You have an accountability not just to the present, but to those who come after you, but also you're accountable for those who came before you. So for me, I think about the sacrifices of my grandfather, and my great grandfather Baba, who was of Ewe descent, and all he had to go through to allow me to be here, and my great grandmother, who I referenced earlier, Mama Sue. And so I have an accountability to take their sacrifices and the privileges that I was able to gain from their work and their survival to now elevate it for those who come after me, and give the necessary tool sets to the future, to continue to build and to continue to push forward, and so I want to encourage people to also think of themselves in that same manner, recognizing that you are not separated from your past or the future.